welcome to the Burnout to Badass podcast. My name is Ellen Schinke, at Coach Ellen on Instagram, and this is my monthly podcast where I am committed to giving you short, no BS episodes to help you, the busy, burned out professional and entrepreneur, find your balance and take back your life from burnout. Let's do this. Hello, my friend, and welcome back to another kick-ass episode of the Burnout to Badass podcast. I am so excited that you're here today because we are going to be talking about something that might not seem related to burnout, but 1,000% is. We are going to talk about clarity, and particular 3 tips to get clear on you. This is going to start a series of podcast episodes where I'm going to kind of be getting into my 5 pillars of my coaching philosophy, my 5 pillars of intuitive achievement. And frankly, I just need to do a podcast on what the hell intuitive achievement is. But to give you a little glimpse into that, basically this is kind of how I approach achievement. I know that you are an ambitious go-getter human. You have a lot of shit you want to achieve, but how do we do that in a way that actually feels good? How do we do that in a way that gives us what we want, gives us that achievement we crave, but without burning us out? We're going to be getting into a series of 5 episodes where we dive deep into each of those pillars. And today we are going to be talking about clarity, giving you 3 tips to get clear on yourself, but first and foremost, addressing why that is so important and how that is actually related to burnout, because it might not feel like it is. So strap yourself in. This is going to be an awesome series of 5 episodes to really kind of round out 2021, since unbelievably this year is almost over. I know, I can't even believe it either. But first and foremost, I just want to thank you again so much for being here, for listening, for checking things out. I appreciate so much that you're here. It means the world to me. And it would also mean the world to me, and I would appreciate it so much if you would check out all of the Black Friday happenings later this week at Coach Ellen. All of these sales are going to start on Black Friday. But if you are on my list, you actually get a head start on those sales. So if you want to get in on that, then go ahead and head to coachellen.com/list and you will get a jump start on those sales that run through Cyber Monday. It is going to be like 50% plus off of the majority of my products, digital courses, and you'll get a sneak peek into some of the fun merch, including the badass tank top. So if you want in on that, definitely check that out. You can get in 24 hours early again through my list. So you can head to coachellen.com. That is ELLYN. So coachellen.com/list to get in on that. And I would just once again just appreciate it so much if you checked that out. And I've kind of broken it out into a little bit of a holiday gift guide. So if one of the things in that kind of is a descriptor of you or someone you love or someone you know, then definitely get in on that. I kind of describe a whole bunch of the different types of personalities that I serve. And who knows, that might describe somebody who's really important in your life. So I would really appreciate that. Thank you so much. And with that, let's go ahead and get into our stuff for today. So today I'm going to be giving you 3 tips to get clear on you. But as I mentioned, before we get into that, I want to talk about why clarity is even something that comes up in conversation with burnout. Like, what the hell does clarity have to do with burnout? Because I know that might be something that you were thinking, maybe something you thought as you read, the title of this. Well, that's exactly what we're going to get into today. Ultimately, clarity is incredibly relevant to burnout, because if we get clear on ourselves, or if we don't get clear on ourselves, we're not going to be able to execute on the other keys and the other pillars that we're going to be talking about in this 5 episode series. So what those other pillars are, my 5 pillars of intuitive achievement, are to get clear on yourself, prioritize your self-care, level up your productivity, know your boundaries, and then implement the 5 anti-hustle habits. Again, we're going to have a podcast on each of these pillars, but let's talk about the why for clarity. So you're not going to be able to execute properly in terms of self-care, productivity, etc. if you're not clear on and if you don't know yourself. Clarity and self-awareness really guide us in terms of what we need for our self-care, for our productivity. You're going to notice that there are aspects of each of these different pillars as we go through them that really require you to know yourself, require you to know what you need. It's not about what some guru online tells you that you need, because let's be honest, nobody but you can determine what you actually need in your life. even when it comes to burnout. Like, I may be a burnout and stress coach, but I don't know what your triggers are. I don't know the ins and outs of your life. I don't know that thing that is stressing you out because it's not obvious. Burnout is a very holistic thing, and the things that are ultimately burning each of us out as individuals are going to vary from individual to individual. So nobody can really dig into that specifically other than you. And that requires personal clarity and self-awareness. Clarity and ultimately having a solid mindset are literally the foundation of achievement without burnout, which is really everything that I'm teaching and talking about here. Is how do we achieve more with less burnout? It's like hell. It is literally at the core of the intuitive part of intuitive achievement, which I touched on just a second ago. You have got to understand yourself. You've got to have compassion for yourself. You've got to be able to respond to the changing seasons and needs of your life. Like, as much as I say that burnout is a choice, I also empathize with the fact that seasons change and we can suddenly become overwhelmed with everything we're carrying. And that's where getting clarity on yourself comes into play, because only through clarity and self-awareness can we know when too much is too much. It is only through that. So today we're going to talk about 3 of the best steps you can take to help you get clear on yourself to ultimately help with your burnout. But first, I do want to be very, very clear about something when it comes to clarity. Creating clarity and getting to know yourself are not things that happen overnight. These are things that take intention. These are things that take consistency. These are things that take vulnerability. Clarity and self-awareness are not one and dones. You're always going to need to keep checking back in and learning about yourself and growing as a result of those check-ins. This is that kind of consistent work, which is the reason why, even me as a burnout coach, I'm in this with you. I still struggle with burnout. I've already mentioned a couple times on this podcast, new as it is, that my most recent bout of burnout happened in August. And the only way I knew to bounce back from that and what to do and what I needed to bounce back from that was through these actions that I'm going to describe to you today. So make no mistake, like, not only am I in this with you, but I have to continue doing this self-awareness and clarity work right there with you. It is a lifestyle commitment, is ultimately kind of what this sort of work is. So I definitely want you to know that going in. And also another important thing that you should know is that self-awareness is not and never should be about judgment. I know I've gone into this before on my website, but I don't know if I've ever really gone into it yet on this podcast. I don't believe I have. But one of the best things we can do when it comes to clarity and self-awareness is treating everything in our life, every observation we make, everything we notice and realize, everything that did or did not work, everything in our life is data. And what really can benefit us is putting on our scientist hat or our lab coat, however you want to think about it, is putting that on and being very objective about the data we're looking at. I've discussed something on my website before that I call the science of life design. And basically what that is just training yourself to look at your life and the things that are happening in your life from a very objective, non-judgmental perspective. And that's what we're talking about here. Like, if there's anything that scientists do well, and, former scientist here, when I say this, it's that we're able to look at data in a non-judgmental, objective way. I didn't realize this until a couple years ago when I was putting together my planner, which if you haven't checked it out, you should at coachellen.com/planner. It's super cool. It's like my baby. I'm very proud of it. But if there's anything that scientists do very well, it is that they're able to do this. They're able to be non-judgmental and objective. And that is something that just by the nature of my background, I've gotten very good at, but it's harder for other people. It's harder for achievers. It's harder for people pleasers and perfectionists because we tend to approach kind of self-judgment as a way to keep ourselves on track. So this is going to be something that's going to be really important to keep in mind when it comes to some of the things we're going to talk about is be non-judgmental. Don't judge yourself. Be very objective. What we're doing here and when we're doing in any of this is we're trying to see the patterns for what they are and learn from the powerful lessons that those patterns can offer us. So just a few things to think about as we get into this, but let's do this. Let's get into the 3 tips. So the 3 tips we're going to be talking about today is knowing and abiding your values, understanding who you are and your personality characteristics, and consistently checking in with yourself. So let's talk about the knowing and abiding your values. This, frankly, in my opinion, is such an underappreciated part of creating clarity in yourself and ultimately overcoming burnout. It's another one of those things that you might be like, what the hell does that have to do with burnout? But I think it has everything to do with burnout, because part of the reason why so many of us get emotionally burned out and out of alignment is because, well, we're not living in a way that is aligned with what we value. And that will burn us out just as much as having a long ass to-do list or an overcommitted social life will. And yet so many people just don't even know what their values are. Like, I had no idea for so long why certain things in my life would just really piss me off the way that they did, and why I would feel like things were missing in my life. I didn't understand until I sat down and hashed out not only what my values were, but what they mean to me. Like, I had no idea that the path I was on as a scientist would never satisfy me professionally, because I valued freedom. And when you're in science, you're kind of trapped in a lab all day. Hell, for me, I was often working in literally a windowless room. Talk about something that is completely opposite of my value of freedom. Like, that is something that can drain even the most motivated person when they're just misaligned. I've done a lot of work when it comes to my values, and values are incredibly personal, but I'm going to go ahead and share some of mine with you and some of the details of mine with you so you can kind of get some context here. So my personal values, and frankly, they're my business values as well, because my business and my personal are so kind of interwoven. My values are freedom, belonging, prosperity, authenticity, and fulfillment. But, and here's something really, really important. This is super important to know. My version of freedom is going to be very different than your version of freedom. It's going to be very different than like the Webster dictionary definition of freedom. Because one of the things I teach in my values course, which you can find on my website, there's actually a blog post that goes along with this podcast episode where I link you to my values mini course. So if as I'm talking about this, you're like, holy shit, I love this, I need to figure out what my values are, go ahead and check that out. You can go to coachellen.com/podcast. And that will send you to my show notes page, and then you'll be linked to the blog from there. So everything's always going to be at coachellen.com/podcast. But one of the big things I teach in my values course is what I call a values statement. And basically what that is, it's where you make things super personal. It's almost like you are providing your own definition for your value, because frankly, I don't care how Google defines it. I could give a shit what Google defines it as. I care what it means to you. So for example, my value of freedom, since that's the one we've been talking about, is represented by this statement: enriching my life through experiences that bring me joy and perspective. Now, that might not mean anything to you, but when I read this, it makes me think of time freedom and location freedom, because to me, it expresses the freedom to choose what feels good in that moment. So if I don't want to work, I'm not going to work. If I want to go, meditate or go for a walk or go on a hike, I can go do that. And that's kind of what this statement expresses to me. It expresses basically that freedom to choose how I'm going to spend my time. And it also represents a bit of growth as well, because when I say experiences that bring me perspective, I'm meaning new experiences that enhance my perspective on the world. So again, my definition of freedom is probably different than yours. And it's definitely different than, Webster's definition. But that's the beauty of all of this. We're able to define these things and what they mean to us and our lives very, very in detail. And it's just an incredibly, incredibly personal thing. So a big part about clarity is knowing your values. And if you're not sure where to start in terms of finding those values, I highly recommend you check out that course. Again, you can go to the show notes at coachellen.com/podcast, and it will walk you through my entire process for figuring out your values. So that's tip number 1, is to ultimately just know and abide your values. And if you don't know them, go ahead and check out that course. The next step here is to know your personality. That's tip number 2, is to know your personality. And I think this one is so stinking crucial, because I'm going to give a really shitty analogy here for a second. But if life is like a long ass hike, like 12 to 20 mile hike, knowing your values is like a compass or a North Star. It is showing you this is where you're going and this is why you're going there. On the other hand, knowing your personality traits is kind of like knowing the pace you should walk at, how much you're physically capable of carrying, how many miles you're able to put in each day. So these kind of work together. Your values are guiding you and keeping you motivated, but knowing your personality is kind of like knowing your own personal operating system and how much you can push yourself and why you're able to push yourself that way. Again, it might be a shitty analogy, but let me take this a little bit further in regard to what I mean. Because I think there are a few different facets in terms of knowing your personality that are really, really important when it comes to managing burnout. We're just going to focus on two today, and the two that I'm going to go ahead and have us focus on are knowing whether you're an introvert or an extrovert and your Enneagram type. So let me explain what I mean by this. So let's start with introversion and extroversion. Did I just say extroversion? OMG, we are so keeping that in. I'm not editing that out. That's great. Introversion and extroversion. So I think this is a really, really important thing, especially when it comes to self-care. We're going to get into, the 5 types of self-care, diving deeper into those. But the one I'm talking about today is social self-care. So how much you engage with people you love, your friends and your family. And I think in this instance, it's really, really important to know whether you're an introvert or an extrovert so that you don't socially overwhelm yourself. But before we do get into this, I want to define one important thing. Introversion is not shyness. It frankly still pisses me off a lot when I hear this because it's so wrong. Introversion and extroversion refer ultimately to where you get your energy from. And I wanted to kind of define those before we went into this. Extroverts get their energy from other people. So they like being in crowds and social environments that energizes them. Introverts aren't like that. Introverts are drained by social events, especially when these events are larger. So it's not about shyness. But it actually can be more complicated than that. There are more complicated personality types, in particular, the outgoing introvert and the shy extrovert. I never fully identified with the introvert label, and I never could understand why until I was in graduate school when I started to realize that I loved people, I loved going out and hanging out, but I would kind of get to a point when I was out with my friends where it was like a switch would flip. I would go from having a really great time to just not wanting to be there anymore. And that is because I am an outgoing introvert. I love socializing. I love people, but I only have a certain amount of social bandwidth. And when I kind of exceed that, I get tapped out and it happens really quickly. It literally is like a switch flips in my brain. So that's that one. And then the shy extrovert is, again, somebody that loves people, loves going out. They are energized by that, but they might struggle a little bit with social anxiety and they might be shy. It kind of seems like an oxymoron, but it's really important, again, to know what personality type you fall into because you can burn yourself out by having too many social commitments on your plate. That is exactly what happened to me over the course of this summer. Is I was unbelievably burned out in September, and I could not figure out why until I looked back at my calendar and realized that I had social commitments every single weekend for like 3 straight months, and I'm an introvert. So that's a really important thing to know when it comes to clarity because you can burn out by overcommitting yourself socially, depending upon your personality type. There's also your Enneagram type. Of all the personality quizzes out there, I love the Enneagram for personal clarity, especially when it comes to burnout, because ultimately, as opposed to kind of telling you some arbitrary characteristics about yourself that frankly don't seem usable, sorry Myers-Briggs, but that's kind of how I feel. The Enneagram personality type really gets down to what your core motivation and kind of your core insecurity and fear are. One other website I was looking at described the Enneagram personality type as the patterns in how people interpret the world and manage their emotions. And I love both of these perspectives because our insecurities are part of the reason why we feel the need to compensate through things like overwork and people pleasing and perfectionism. And from the other side, Lack of or improper emotional management is a huge contributor to emotional burnout. So I freaking love the Enneagram. If you're unfamiliar with the Enneagram, I'm not going to go into the 9 different types now. There are people who literally have entire podcasts dedicated to the Enneagram, but basically there are 9 types and each type has its own core motivation and struggle that it deals with. And it just kind of helps you figure out what you need from an emotional perspective and what habits you need to look out for in yourself. In my experience, and again, I have this all in the blog post that goes with this podcast. So again, coachellen.com/podcast, and it will link you to this accompanying blog post. But you can typically read through the different 9 Enneagram types and really see yourself in one. But for those of you that are struggling with typing yourself, I would recommend taking the Enneagram assessment to see which one you are. So tip number 1 was to ultimately know your values and really abide your values. Tip number 2 was to know your personality, introversion, extroversion, as well as Enneagram type. So then last but not least is tip number 3, check in with yourself frequently. So we've talked about clarity very much from the know yourself perspective. Now we're kind of talking about it from the continue knowing yourself, build self-awareness perspective. Of all the things we're going to talk about today, this is perhaps the most important. And it's also the one that you're probably going to hear me talk about the most frequently. But that does not change how important this is. Ultimately, to get clear on yourself, the most important thing you can do is to check in with yourself. And this is not only important just for having clarity, but for helping yourself through burnout, because we live in a very dynamic world. Things are constantly changing and moving, and we are constantly changing and moving with them. And if we're not aware of how those changes affect us, we will have no idea how to support ourselves. So consistently checking in with yourself can be one of the biggest superpowers you can have when it comes to managing your burnout. And 2 of my favorite ways to get this consistently in your life is to do personal reviews and journaling. Journaling is a little bit of a less formal way to do a self-reflection, but I find it important because having a consistent journaling practice can bring to light some of the very things that you've been emotionally struggling to process, but you've been burying down. So again, we have to be non-judgmental when we're doing this, but it's through doing this kind of vulnerable work that we're able to uncover the things that might be sapping our emotional energy. Again, emotional burnout is all about emotional exhaustion. So like, hell, if you were to sit down and journal and the emotion is pouring out of you, literally pouring out of your pen, you're having a good ugly cry while you're journaling, it's a good bet that part of what's been leading to your exhaustion is all sorts of unexpressed emotion that you've been carrying. So that's the power of consistently sitting down and journaling, is you're giving yourself an outlet for all of that unexpressed emotion. The other avenue that, if you follow me at all, you know that I love this, is a review. I love me a good review. And I think this is a great practice to catch the things that might be a little bit more subtle. Like sometimes emotions can be easy to ignore, and a lot of us achievers are really guilty of just kind of trying to shove down our emotions and get rid of them. But I really like this one for the things that are more subtle. So I already mentioned that, through August, I was very burned out in August, and it very much bled into September. And it was not because I was working too much. In fact, that was part of why I was so confused about why I was burned out, because I was no longer working a lot. So it didn't explain the burnout that I was feeling, but it came to light through these kind of reviews that the reason why I was burned out was because 1, I was not taking enough alone time, and 2, the idea of cooking for myself drained me. It doesn't have to make sense why these things drain you, and I kind of laugh at myself with this whole cooking thing, but those were the 2 big things that came out of me looking back through my recent reviews. They were kind of the logistical aspects of my life, but it ultimately kind of boiled down to how I was spending my time. And the only reason I figured these things out was because of doing reviews and kind of looking back through them and finding a pattern. Like, I literally am somebody who believes so much in self-reflection that I have a morning mindfulness self-reflection journal and 2 planners. And what I'm obsessed with about my planners, both my paper planner and my digital planner, is that self-reflection is a built-in part of these planners. It's like the whole premise of the planner. They have weekly reviews, monthly reviews, and quarterly reviews. And it is just a built-in part of the system, which is so helpful for people who, that's not something that they naturally do. But this is how I trained myself to do this, is I created, I had an old bullet journal that I had these systems built into. And I literally sit down and I do a weekly review, a monthly review, and a quarterly review. And the amount of answers that I'm able to get from those and questions I'm able to ask myself and things and patterns that I'm able to learn, it is mind-blowing. So that is kind of the last tip here, is to check in with yourself. Journal, do that weekly review. And if you do need some support and help with that, check out some of the products on my website, the journal, the planners, etc. But those are my 3 tips to help you get clear on you, to know your values, know your personality type, and ultimately to check in consistently with yourself. And it is going to help you so much when it comes to your burnout, because it's going to help you identify those specific action steps you need to take. Not the arbitrary ones, not the ones some random guru online told you to take, but the ones that you specifically need for where you are at in your burnout. So that is all I've got for you today. We're going to get into our next pillar of our 5 pillars next time, talking all about self-care and what it actually looks like, because there's so many misconceptions around it. I hope you got so much out of today. If there was a tip that really stuck out to you, or you have any questions, hop on over to Instagram, shoot me a DM at Coach Ellen. I would love to hear from you. Otherwise, you have a great rest of your week. Happy Thanksgiving to all of my American friends, and I will talk to you all next time. Bye.